This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin and a world-renowned expert in the history of the British Empire. He is now in Israel to attend a workshop held at the Leer Institute dedicated to exploring the legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement signed by the eponymous French and British diplomats exactly 100 years ago, which has shaped the boundaries of the Middle East as we know it until this very day. Professor William Roger Lewis, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Good morning.
So when the British government endorsed the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, what were the imperial interests they were trying to pursue?
Well, I think it's helpful to think of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in relation to the Balfour Declaration, which declared, of course, that the British would help Israel, to help the Zionists to find a national home in Palestine. The motives for that, I think, help to explain also the Sykes-Picot Agreement. In other words, the British had an interest in the Eastern Mediterranean. They had an interest in what would become the fate of the Ottoman Empire. And at the same time, they were concerned, of course, with winning the First World War. So both of these agreements, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, took place at a critical time of the year when it was not at all obvious or clear which side was winning. It could well have been that it would be the German side that would emerge triumphant. So the British aim at this period in the war was to find a means to rally the Jews in Europe, in Russia, and the United States to the Allied cause. So this was one motive. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the motive was to try to keep the French out of the Eastern Mediterranean insofar as it was possible. So this was, in fact, the story of the division of the Ottoman Empire as seen from the point of view of midway through the First World War. No one, of course, could predict the outcome, but the British had pretty clear ideas about what they would like the outcome to be. So the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement as well was based on the premise that if they could secure the support of the Jews in all parts of the world, this meant Russia, Germany, the United States, there was the underlying idea that the Jews might be able to tip the balance and help the Allies win the war. This was based on what we would now call a conspiracy theory, that there was such a thing as international Jewry, in which the international and political and individual links would help to tilt the balance in favor of the British.
So if it was the same rationale that led the British government to sign the Sykes-Picot Agreement and to issue the Balfour Declaration, why was there such a gap between the two? It was almost a year, or even more than a year, between the signing of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. If they wanted to rally the Jews, why didn't they issue the Balfour Declaration months and years, and even up to a year before?
In part, it was a desperation as the war progressed, and it became increasingly apparent that the Allies, the British, were in desperate straits. This was a sign that they needed to secure all of the support that they could. They had an increasingly more geographical and political knowledge of what would happen to the Ottoman Empire in the event of its eventual collapse. And so this was the combined motive of trying to win the war and also try to achieve a basis for peace in the Middle East that would help the Jews to have a national home in Palestine, which to the British mind was not necessarily a Jewish state. There was critical ambiguity about this that continued to evolve over the years.
Mm-hmm. And the British interests, other than catering to the Jews, were holding on to Palestine, to Jordan, to Iraq. What were the regional interests that led them, apart from catering to the Jews?
Well, one view was that the British were in the process of achieving an all-red route all the way from the Cape in Africa to Cairo. In other words, the all-red route from the Cape to Cairo, which would extend from the eastern Mediterranean, from the area known as Palestine, through Iraq, Iran, on to India, on to Malaya, and on to Australia and New Zealand.
Mm-hmm. And so the agreement was planned to ensure that?
No, that was a visionary plan. And in terms of real interest, it meant that the British would try to secure the region in the Middle East that they thought would be most to their advantage, which, of course, included the oil resources of Iraq, in which they already had a pretty good idea that this would be an invaluable resource.
Did the French know all this when they signed
the French
agreement?
had a pretty good idea, but the French had a different sort of priority. The priority of the French was to defeat the Germans.
So they were willing to pay a price in terms of resources and imperial control for the sake of
for the sake of British support, above all on the Western Front, above all in Europe, so that the French definitely had interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and interests that went back for several centuries. But when it came right down to it, the French interest in the Eastern Mediterranean was secondary to the winning of the war in Western Europe.
How was it received in Istanbul and Berlin? You said it was signed at a time that it wasn't yet clear who was winning the war. Did they take it seriously, the Germans and the Ottomans?
Well, there was, of course, the agreements didn't become public knowledge until the Russians, after the Bolsheviks, after the revolution, began to publish the ideas. So it came as a surprise to many people, not least the American administration in Washington, which is not to say that the French, as well as the Turks, didn't have a pretty good idea of what might transpire in the event of an Allied victory. Or, on the other hand, the possibility that the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire might remain intact.
Mm-hmm. And when the war ended and indeed it was it implemented word for word, or was it amended after the war?
It was certainly amended. The Sykes-Picot agreement was a rough geographical agreement which had to be modified considerably so that it would make some geographical and political, ethnic, geographical sense after the war. So they went through several evolutions until the boundaries were actually secured in the aftermath of the war, 1919, 1921, 22.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us examples of a few highlights of the amendments that were made?
Well, the amendments were rather analogous to the boundary settlements that were drawn up in Africa in the last part of the 19th century. In other words, there were the equivalent of commissions that would investigate the territorial, tribal boundaries and try to adjust the European agreement so that there was some degree of common sense that lay behind the geographical knowledge. It is significant in retrospect that there was such a command of the local geography by the British and the French at the time of the...
Yet, as we know now, the boundaries of countries like Syria and Iraq that were drafted...
Yes, well, that is the principal point, I believe, that these boundaries of the First World War settlement from 1916, 17, 1919 onwards have remained intact for virtually a century. So what we're witnessing now is a redrawing of the boundaries of the Middle East, or a possible redrawing of the boundaries of the Middle East that have remained intact for 100 years.
Yeah, so what we can say now is that they didn't really address the demographic issues entirely with the current boundaries that we see there.
No, the boundaries are drawn according to a division, what we might call a division of the spoils. In other words, primarily after the Russians drop out of the war, between the British and the French, with some concessions to the Italians, other European trade negotiations. But on the whole, it was a settlement between the British and the French, and the French had their own ideas about what might be the best solution to the problems of the Middle East, whereupon they almost immediately went after what they called a larger or expanded Lebanon, which would be more directly under control of the French, more direct control than in the Syrian dimension of the...
Was it their equivalent of the Balfour Declaration, just with the Christian Lebanese, the same as the British saw the Jews as a foothold in Palestine and, by extension, in the whole region?
That's one way of looking at it, I suppose, but I think that the main point is that it looked a little different from the French perspective. In other words, French control, but with the idea that the natives, as they were called, would be assimilated into the French political and cultural state, so that inhabitants of Lebanon or Syria would eventually be able to politically acquire political positions in France. They would be able to become members of the French Parliament. This was never in the minds of the British. In other words, the British believed in Sir Frederick Lugard called it the dual mandate, that the British were there for the dual purpose of helping the regions to develop economically, but also, of course, to help the British to secure the trade and economic wealth of the regions. But there was never any idea on the British side that they would be incorporated into the body proper, as was the case on the French side. Mm-hmm.
If you look at the British control of Palestine and the aftermath of the Balfour Declaration, we all know that at some point, pretty early on, the British government realized that it might have been a mistake to issue the Balfour Declaration and implement it in the way that it was implemented and retracted gradually. Did they have similar sentiments vis-à-vis the Sykes-Picot agreement?
I'm not sure quite what you mean.
Did they realize at some point that it might have been a bad idea and try to do damage control?
This was a difficulty from the very beginning. It was Winston Churchill, when he was at the Colonial Office in the period immediately following the war, that had to cope with the what he regarded as the contradiction of providing a home for the Jews in essentially an Arab country, and what they would do with the problem of Jewish immigration. So the solution to Churchill was what he called economic absorptive capacity. In other words, Jewish immigration according to the limit that it could be tolerated by the Arabs and incorporated harmoniously with Arab cooperation. Now, this led, of course, to further controversies about what the political future of Palestine might be. And this, as you know, came to a head in the late 1930s with the Royal Commission appointed to try to figure out what the future of Palestine would be. This was the Royal Commission of 1937, the Peel Commission, in which the Oxford historian Reginald Coupland played a prominent part, and believed that the future of the territory would best be solved by partition between the Jews and the Arabs. This was the conclusion of the Royal Commission, but it was controversial, so controversial that by the end of the 1930s, it was not at all clear that this would be a possible solution, especially with the approach of war. And this was the time that they reversed the idea or the solution proposed by the Peel Commission and implemented the notorious or famous White Paper of 1939, the purpose of which was to severely limit Jewish immigration into Palestine because of the impending war with Europe. So the primary purpose on the British side was to preserve as much goodwill as they could with the Arab states. They needed Arab support in the Second World War, above all for the resources such as oil, but above all also simply for the political strategic support that they would gain through friendship with the Arab states. Mm-hmm. So from the Jewish side, this was a disaster because it virtually sealed off the possibility of Jewish immigration at the time of greatest need for the Jews under the Germans.
And what about the other Arab territories in the Middle East that were under the auspices of the British Empire? Did they present an equal amount of trouble for the British administration?
Oh, yes, because even in Egypt and as well as Iraq, from the Arab point of view, it's by no means clear that the British would actually win the war. So in Iraq, there was an rebellion. In Egypt, the British could never quite be sure whether the Egyptians would support the British throughout the course of the war, or whether there was a pro-German sympathy in view of the possibility that the Germans might win in the end.
Mm-hmm. And how did that lead to the decolonization of the Middle East a mere few years afterwards?
Well, of course, the main point is that the Allies, the British, did win the war, and the problem thereafter was the future of the Middle East. This was determined in large part by the Labour government after victory in 1945, the administration of Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin. And Ernest Bevin was the key figure. He was the foreign secretary, and the policy towards Palestine was, in effect, Ernest Bevin's policy.
Mm-hmm. So he promoted the gradual withdrawal of the British Empire from these areas? Was it his idea?
Ernest Bevin wanted quite to the contrary, to retain control and influence over all of the Middle East. Ernest Bevin's idea was that by control over the Middle East, it would help Britain to remain a great power in the world. One of the big three, with Russia, the United States, and with Britain.
Was it realistic at all at the time?
It seemed realistic to Ernest Bevin at the time, but it depended on whether they could retain control over the Middle Eastern countries. Bevin was quite realistic in the sense that he believed that there had to be a revolution in British attitudes towards the Arabs, that they had to regard the Arabs as equal human beings, and this was a revolutionary thought at the time. But if they did so, they would be able to cooperate with the Arabs to sustain British hegemony in the Middle East to the benefit of both sides, the Arabs and the British. But, of course, the stumbling block was Palestine.
Yeah, but did it reflect similar imperial attitudes or policies in India and in Africa? Or was the Middle East a separate case?
The Middle East was the principal area in the world that Ernest Bevin was directly concerned with. Because of the divisions within the British government, it was the India office rather than the Foreign Office that was in charge of the India part of it. So the political events leading to partition in India, those events were taking place at the same time that Ernest Bevin and the Foreign Office were trying to come to terms with what the future of Palestine would be. The result was the same. Partition in India in August 1947, partition in Palestine in May 1948, along the same lines, but India, of course, on a much more huge scale.
Did they see the equivalence, or was it just a haphazard decision that was made in the two cases?
Bevin wanted to hold on to Palestine almost at all cost, but in the course of 1947, began to realize that the Zionists, the Jews in Palestine, had an efficient fighting force, and that the British would be up against the question of whether to subdue the Zionists with the force of the British military forces, which was really an impossible proposition in view of the British public, which simply wouldn't tolerate this type of military invasion, suppression by post-war Britain, not only for idealistic reasons, but also simply because of the cost. This was still Britain. 1947 was still on wartime rations, and it was a tremendous cost to support the army, the police, the administration in Palestine.
How much of these sentiments remained after the mandate ended in May 1948 and Israel gained independence? Did it dictate the British government's attitude towards the state of Israel just the same?
There were two reactions. One was on the part that the Balfour Declaration had from the very beginning been a mistake. In fact, Ernest Bevin is on record as saying that the Balfour Declaration was the single greatest error in the history of the British Empire. On the other hand, those who had been anti-Zionist, Lord Hailsham is a good example, anti-Zionist until 1948, changed his views because he held the attitude that we have been responsible for the creation of what they would refer to as Frankenstein's monster, the creation of the State of Israel. But now that we have created it, we have to be responsible for it, and we have to help it as best we can in the United Nations, in Israel itself, which isn't to say that there weren't reservations on the part of a lot of British about what the significance of the creation of the State of Israel was. Now, in America, of course, it was on the whole a popular decision because the United States was helping to assist a people that had been decimated by the Nazis during the war. But in Britain, it was a much more divided opinion because the British soldiers, the actual fight against Zionist, what the British called terrorism, taken a tremendous toll. So there was a very ambivalent view in Britain about the result in May 1948.
Mm-hmm. And only 8 years later, the British government and the Israeli government joined hands and launched the Suez campaign that here in Israel is known as the Sinai War. How did you reach from this state of almost overt hostility and to joining hands together in trying to determine the diplomatic future of the region?
The Suez operation was essentially a French idea. The French believed that President Nasser, as the head of the Egyptian government, was somehow responsible for the troubles in Algeria. The French used the analogy that Egypt under Nasser was like an octopus with tentacles stretching out throughout the Middle East, and if you could lop off the head of the octopus, then the tentacles would shrivel, and France and Algeria would live together happily forever after. It was a monumental miscalculation. But many of these things appear absurd in retrospect, but they seemed real at the time. So the French proposed to the British that there should be a joint operation against Egypt, but they knew that they had to bring in the Israelis for practical logistical support. So the idea was that the Israelis would launch an attack on Egypt, and Britain and France would then intervene to keep the two sides separate and impose a peace.
Mm-hmm. And London in 1956 trusted the Israelis already to pursue its
It wasn't
interests?
a matter so much of trust as it was of necessity, of friendship designed on the practical necessity for the combined operations. So David Ben-Gurion was also very suspicious of the British for good reason. So each side, the French, the British, and the Israelis, made their decision based on what they believed to be their national interest. It did turn out to be a disastrous operation because it was not planned so that it was integrated and operated at the same time successfully, but also because they misestimated the reaction of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When would you say were the Israeli-British relations fully normalized? Not in a technical sense, but when did the hostilities subside on the part of the British?
Well, after the withdrawal, after the end of the Suez Crisis, the British influence in the Middle East diminished dramatically, and it was only 2 years after Suez that there was a revolution in Iraq, the revolution of 1958, which meant the destruction of a major part of the British informal empire in the Middle East. And from then on, it was a question of how long the empire of influence would endure, and it did endure until the withdrawal from the Gulf in 1971. In the meantime, the British relations with the Israelis tended to be the same as it would between the British and any of the other post-colonial states. In other words, the British were in Israel as observers, but what they did believe after the 1967 war was that the future of the region was quite precarious. They thought, in fact, according to the British reports at the time, that it might evolve into a political system that would be similar to the South African situation of political system of apartheid. This is actually there's actually political evidence of this in the British records. On the other hand, there was some optimism on the part of the Foreign Office, the people directly concerned with Israel, who believed that eventually the relations between the Israeli government and the West Bank, the Palestinians, could eventually be stabilized, if over a period of centuries. In other words, a very long time.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is all very interesting, and we'll leave it there. Professor William Roger Lewis, well-known expert in the history of the British Empire, professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you very much for joining us today. And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at Gilad_Halpern. I tweet mainly about the review, and don't hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
רכישת רוח ים מנשבת מאי שם וכביסה מתנפנפת לצילי